Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seventh installment of our High Elevation 5 Needle White Pines 2025-2026 Science and Management webinar series. I'm Enzo Martelli-Moya, a PhD student in Kara Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and I'm your host this month and co-organizing this series with Karina Lee, a master's student at the University of Colorado, Denver, and Lou DeLuzzi, a PhD student in Daniel Ulrich lab at Montana State University. Today we have another great presentation, and I'd like to start by introducing our board member, Bob Keane, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Bob.
Everyone, thanks for tuning into this wonderful webinar series. Enzo and Karina, you are doing a great job. I'm just here to give you a few highlights of what the foundation has been doing. First, we just awarded our first three student scholarships for 2026. Each of them were at 2,000 apiece. I know who got them, but they haven't been informed yet. So we're going to have to wait for the Nutcracker notes in order for you to find out who exactly got those scholarships. But we awarded the Van Gundy scholarship and two Cage scholarships to two other people, so three total. We are looking for more new people to run for a board or office position for the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. If you're interested, please let me know. Bob Keane, I'm at bobkeane@whitebarkfound.org. Our next meeting is going to be in Lake Tahoe, September 23rd and 24th. Beautiful area, beautiful lake. Please, would you join us there? And if you haven't got a copy of Nutcracker Notes, you better make sure you have a copy of Nutcracker Notes for this spring issue because it's the 25th anniversary issue. And yes, that's right. Nutcracker Notes and WPEF are in their 25th year. And lastly, Haley Moran is going to put some information on the Canadian conference in the chat box if you want to know and want to be informed about the Canadian conference. And with that, I'll send it back to you, Enzo.
Thank you so much, Bob. So if you missed any of our previous installments, you can find those recordings on our talks on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks, and the link to our website will be posted in the chat in a few seconds. And finally, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments, doubts, and questions, and please post them on the chat box, and our team will be collecting them throughout Jeremy's presentation. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Jeremy Greenberg. He recently completed his Master's of Science in Forestry at the University of British Columbia, where his research focused on whitebark pine conservation. He has also worked with Parks Canada for the past 14 years, contributing to conservation and management efforts across protected areas. In recent years, Jeremy's work has centered on whitebark pine conservation in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier National Parks, where he has supported monitoring, restoration, and long-term management initiative. And if either of the attendees today was at the Revelstoke conference, you might remember one of his talks. His experience integrates applied fieldwork with research to inform conservation strategies for these at-risk species. Since 2023, Jeremy has also served on the board of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada, contributing to broader efforts to advance conservation research and collaboration for high elevation 5-needle pines. And with that, I'll leave it to Jeremy. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. I'll do the hardest part of the day, which is trying to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see this?
We're good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the awesome intro, Enzo. My name's Jeremy Greenberg. I'll be presenting to you today I was thinking about just presenting on my research, but I figured it might be a good opportunity to also talk about my day job here at Parks Canada, where I work on whitebark pine conservation. I can give you kind of a state of what we've been up to in Canada in that as well. So I figured I'd start off, there you go, with a little introduction on whitebark pine, go into a little section on the conservation and restoration of whitebark pine in the Canadian National Parks, and then move on to investigating the effects of fire and fire surrogates on whitebark pine in Glacier National Park, British Columbia, which is my master's thesis. I realized there's a Glacier National Park in the States too. It's very confusing that we have two name the same thing, but this one's in Canada. I'm assuming if you're here to listen to a whitebark pine talk, most of the people here know a little bit about whitebark pine at least, but I'll just give you a quick introduction. Whitebark pine is the only tree to be listed as endangered in Western Canada and United States, where it occupies the subalpine to kind of the subalpine alpine ecotones of the mountains of Western North America. It's a keystone species and provides many important abiotic services. Ecosystem services, including runoff retention, snowmelt mitigation, stuff like that, and also biotic services, mostly in the form of its large seeds, which are very nutritious, and they're a very important food source for animals like grizzly bears, black bears, squirrels, lots of birds. The decline of the species may have cascading effects on this fragile ecosystem. And whitebark pine is in decline for three main reasons. The first, and maybe the most important, is white pine blister rust, which is an introduced fungal pathogen that kind of came into North America from East Asia in the early 1900s and has since spread throughout. It affects all five needle pines and not just whitebark pine, but whitebark pine seems to be particularly susceptible. The life cycle of white pine blister rust is very complicated, but maybe the only thing you really need to know is that it can't really travel from tree to tree. It has to travel from ribes species, so currants, to whitebark pine and then back again. When it enters the whitebark pine tree, it kind of enters through the needles, travels through the branches, and eventually to the bole, and it can create these cankers after about 2 years, which is where it bursts out to release spores for the future generation of blister rust. And when it does this, it can girdle the tree and prevent nutrient and water transport past that point, which eventually generally leads to tree death. In Glacier National Park, where I work, just for a kind of general idea of how serious this problem is, the infection rates of whitebark pine are around 80%, and most of these trees will die. The second threat is mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle are a bark beetle that are endemic to the forests of Western North America. Large-scale outbreaks are common, and they affect all pines, not just whitebark pine. With changing climate, we've been seeing larger scale outbreaks and also kind of habitat expansion of mountain pine beetle into places where they were previously thermally excluded. So, for example, up north of where they were before and also into higher elevation forests, which is not great for whitebark pine, which live in high elevation forests. Lastly, we have fire. The relationship between whitebark pine and fire is quite complicated. Whitebark pine is not very fire tolerant. If just 75% of the bole is charred, then mortality is almost certain. So even at just at the base of the tree, you have a little bit of charring, you're probably going to kill the tree. If only 40% of the canopy is scorched, again, the tree is probably going to die. Fire can also destroy seed sources that are already struggling from mountain pine beetle and white pine blister rust, which can lead to the loss of self-sustaining populations. However, fire is also important and indeed necessary for whitebark pine in some habitats. And the reason is that whitebark pine is not shade tolerant. It doesn't do well with competition. So in forests such as this one here, where competing species have kind of grown up around it, it can get outcompeted and it can rely on fire to go in and remove that competition. The second reason that fire is important has to do with this bird. It's the Clark's nutcracker, with whom it has an obligate mutualistic relationship. Basically, in the fall, I apologize. First of all, this is a picture of a limber pine, not a whitebark pine, but it's the one. But in the fall, the Clark's nutcracker comes in and collects seeds from whitebark pine trees and catches them as a future food source. And it doesn't remember where it cast all those seeds, and those become our future whitebark pine forest. Fire is important because it preferentially selects open sites, primarily burns and avalanche paths, for caching seeds. Without these open sites, nutcrackers may select suboptimal sites like low elevation forests or ones that have too much competition and shading for whitebark pine to establish. All these threats are bad enough on their own, but they also work together to create some sort of extinction vortex. So, for example, if we have no fire because we've been um, preventing fire on the landscape for over or close to 100 years, we may have infilling of forest, which can lead to the pine beetle coming in, since pine beetle preferentially attacks unhealthy trees, which can mean that trees don't have as much defense against white pine blister rust, which can mean that we, as trees die, we have more dead and downed woody fuels, which can lead to more fire severity, which can kill more trees. Just an example of what can be going on here. But yeah, they're all working together. So what is Parks Canada doing about it? Well, this is exciting. I have the best job in the world, and I stole these slides from my boss, Natalie Staffel, and adapted them a bit. Some of you may have seen this presentation before because you've been giving it to quite a few groups, but if you've seen it before, don't worry, I'll get to new stuff soon. So whitebark pines range extends kind of throughout the mountains of US and Canada, but 56% of it actually lies within Canada. I'll kind of be focusing, if you see this kind of little arrow of whitebark pine habitat on the eastern side of the Canada, or to the Canadian range, that's where I'll be focusing this talk, just because that's where we have our mountain parks. So the mountain parks, there's 7 of them: Jasper, Banff, Kootenay, Yoho, Glacier, and Mount Revelstoke, where I work, and Waterton Lake. And they kind of extend across the Rocky and Columbia mountain ranges. So we have a conservation standards working group, which was started by Parks Canada in 2018, but is now run by the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. It's kind of an informal interagency recovery team focusing on whitebark pine. And we've come up with this very lofty goal of creating self-sustaining, rust-resistant metapopulations of whitebark and limber pine throughout its Canadian range, which sounds hard, but we're working on it. So what are we doing? Well, first of all, we've set up long-term monitoring transects to kind of feed into an ecological integrity monitoring metric to see how whitebark pine are doing across the range in Canada. This is an interagency effort. It's not just parks. It also involves Alberta and BC governments and the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. Basically, the first plots for this were set up in 2003, and they're remeasured every 5 years to monitor the trends inside and outside of parks. There's some great papers you can read that have been published from this data. Most recent one was, I think, last year. And I'll just draw your attention to this map for future of this talk. This is the predicted probability of canopy kill from white pine blister rust. And you'll notice that Revelstoke, which is where I work, is pretty close to the red here. So the first thing we want to do for whitebark pine conservation is to identify our trees that may be putatively resistant to white pine blister rust. So what we do is we go into stands that are heavily infected with over 70% infection rates and identify trees that look like they're healthy. And we call those plus trees. The idea that is that these trees may have some sort of genetic resistance to white pine blister rust. And in kind of July, we go in and put cages over the cones to stop animals from eating them, and then collect those cones in September. Some of the seeds go to nurseries for growing, and others get submitted to blister rust resistance testing, which I'll cover more later. So the seeds we grow in the nursery, we just plant back out into the landscape, primarily in burn sites. These are basically just trying to get as many putatively resistant whitebark pine seedlings out in the landscape as possible. We do monitor a subset of these seedlings from tracked parent trees at every 2, 5, and 10 years to kind of see how they're doing out in the landscape and which parent trees are worth collecting from. We also deploy anti-pine beetle pheromones onto our plus trees. This includes GLV, which is greenleaf volatiles, which tells the pine beetle that the tree is a broadleaf tree, and verbenone, which are basically tells the pine beetles that the tree is already fully occupied by other beetles and they should move on. This has been especially important in Jasper National Park, where they had a very large scale mountain pine beetle outbreak that kind of peaked in 2017, 2018. We have a blister rust resistance testing program that's done at Kalamalka Research Center and is led by the BC Ministry of Forests. It's very similar to the rust screening program that's done in Jarina, if you're familiar with that. Parks Canada staff go and help with the spring blister rust assessment and midsummer inoculation. And the idea is that we inoculate seedlings from tracked parent trees with blister rust spores, and then we plant them in rows and see how they do over a long time period. So for example, in this photo, you can see you have a row of red and dead trees. Those trees probably don't have a genetic resistance to white pine blister rust, whereas a row that is looking very healthy and green might. Here's just a quick look at what that inoculation process is, just because it's really fun to do. We collect heavily infected ribes leaves and they put them on this tray above our seedlings, and they rain spores down until we hit a very specific spore load. And this usually takes a really long time. So go in the morning, and then usually we can get the seedlings out of there around midnight or even the next morning. So the trees that we identify as being resistant to white pine blister rust through that testing program are called elite trees. They kind of get upgraded from plus trees to elite trees. And once they're identified, we visit them in the winter and collect scion, which is kind of genetic material. Scion is basically branch tips that we collect in the upper third of the tree. And we used to do this in the fall during our trunk collection because logistically it's way easier, but we had limited success. So we've moved on to doing it in the winter when trees are fully dormant. Once we collect that scion, it gets grafted onto rootstock, a mature tree. So it'll be able to produce cones much faster than just a seedling that we're growing in a nursery. And we take these clones and place them into seed orchards, which we have 2 in Canada. One is in Prince George in BC, and the other one's in Elkhart, also in BC. And what this will do is when these reach a height that they can actually produce cones, we'll have an easily accessible seed source for elite trees. And it's also creating kind of genetic clones. So if the tree gets, for example, burnt down in the wild, then we have clones of it that we can collect seed from. We're not losing that genetic material. Lastly, we're also doing ecosystem restoration. So using fire and fire surrogates to restore whitebark pine habitat. Fire surrogates, for the purpose of the rest of this talk, are thinning treatments to emulate the positive effects of fire. So in places where fire may not be appropriate, we can go in and remove all the understory vegetation and competing trees to kind of emulate the effects of fire. They can range from very small scale treatments, less than 1 hectare, to large scale mechanical thinning operations. So to date, we have planted in the Canadian National Parks almost 130,000 whitebark pine trees, all of which are putatively resistant to white pine blister rust. We've identified 874 whitebark pine plus trees, as well as 26 elite trees, which are confirmed to have genetic resistance to white pine blister rust. We have 142 parent trees that are currently in screening. That's for whitebark pine and limber pine. Limber pine is a tree that's very similar to whitebark pine and faces the same threats, but occupies slightly different habitats. And we have restored around 2,778 hectares, which is 6,865 acres of whitebark pine habitat through prescribed fire and thinning. And I apologize, I'm going to try and uh, remember to have imperial units here. I just am really used to using metric. Okay, so that was a quick overview of what Parks Canada is doing with whitebark pine. I'll now move on to my master's research, which is investigating the effects of fire and fire surrogates on whitebark pine in Glacier National Park, BC. I collected all this data in 2023, and I just wanted to begin this little section by acknowledging that Rogers Pass in Glacier National Park, where I did my fieldwork and where I work, is on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, Sinixt, and Syilx Okanagan people. And at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, where I did all my research, is on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I feel like I gave a pretty good introduction with that whole lead up here, but my research question was, how do fire and fire surrogates impact whitebark pine? And I kind of wanted to frame this around the reasons that we're using fire and fire surrogates. I really wanted to keep this research kind of operationally based and useful for guiding future operations. So I thought about what the goals are of using fire and fire surrogate treatments and kind of came up with four. The first is to protect mature whitebark pine trees by applying low severity fire and reducing fuel loads. The second is to alleviate competition from mature whitebark pine by reducing the density of competing trees and understory vegetation. The third is to reduce the severity of future fires by lowering fuel loads and mitigating wildfire risk. And lastly, to enhance whitebark pine regeneration by creating suitable caching areas for Clark's nutcracker and reducing competition from overstory and understory vegetation. You don't need to remember these, I'll come back to them one at a time. So, welcome to Glacier National Park. It's a 1,300 square kilometer or 521 square mile federally protected area that's located in the southeastern corner of BC. It's known for its large old growth cedars and Douglas firs, rugged glaciated terrain, and mountain-based recreation. And it's very beautiful. There's about a 150-year fire return interval in the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir forest, which is kind of our whitebark pine forests here. And most fires in the subalpine are small and low severity, with occasional large, high severity fire that generally comes up from lower elevation forests and spreads through the subalpine forest. It's a unique context for whitebark pine in Canada because Glacier National Park is located in the inland temperate rainforest. So we get a ton of precipitation. There's 155 days of snowfall per year, with the average snowfall in Glacier National Park being 10 meters, which is 32 feet of snow. The highest ever snowfall was in 1966, or highest ever recorded snowfall, which was 15 meters or 50 feet of snow. It also receives abundant summer and spring precipitation in the form of rain, around 287 millimeters per year, or 11 inches, but also experiences kind of periods of drought in the summer. So we need to evaluate how fire-based restoration works in this distinct setting. My study beyond just being in Glacier National Park was focused to the Bald Hill, which is where this red X is on the map. It's a rolling ridgeline that runs north to south along the eastern boundary of Glacier National Park, and is considered to be the southern limit of the Purcell Mountains. It tops out at around 7,200 feet, which is barely in the alpine here. And it's kind of prime whitebark pine habitat, especially above 1,800 meters or 5,900 feet. Kind of forms the subalpine forest to that subalpine alpine ecotone that whitebark pine love. It's the location of all of the whitebark pine in Glacier National Park that have been deemed to be elite. So it's a very important place for us. And it also gave a really good opportunity for investigating the effects of fire and fire surrogates, because in 2018, Parks Canada went in and conducted thinning treatments around our high value whitebark pine trees to protect them from future fire. So these are pretty small scale treatments, basically just removing all of the vegetation and competing trees from a little bit more than a tree length around the trees. And then in 2018, we also had a large, so same year, we had a large high severity fire that burnt just beside those thinning treatments. And then in 2020, Parks Canada conducted a prescribed fire that burnt directly adjacent to, and in two cases, actually over the thin treatments. So that gave us 5 treatments that we can look into. The first was thinning, where we had 8 plots. Second was wildfire, where we had 6 plots. We have prescribed fire with 9 plots. Thinning and prescribed fire, where we only had 2 plots because only 2 of those thin treatments actually burnt. And then 9 control plots. And I'll just move straight on to the results of the discussion. If you want to know more about my methodology, I'm happy to talk about it later, but I figure it's not really that interesting to most of you. So if you'll remember, our first goal for using fire and fire surrogates for whitebark pine restoration was to protect mature whitebark pine trees by reducing or by applying low severity fire and reducing fuel load to minimize fire-related mortality. So to assess this, we compared mortality across treatments by primary mortality type. And here are our results. This is a stacked bar graph. On the x-axis, we have treatment type. On the y-axis, we have mortality of mature whitebark pine by mortality type. And there's a few things I want you to take away from this. First of all, mortality was high across all treatments. Even in our control treatment, 70% of the whitebark pine were found to be dead. Even in the thinning treatment, which in 2018 we went in and removed every dead whitebark pine tree, so they can't have been, or they weren't assessed, 45% of the whitebark pine are dead. In the wildfire and prescribed fire treatments, every single whitebark pine is dead. In the wildfire treatment, 100% of those had fire as their primary cause of mortality. In the prescribed fire, 46% of them died from fire. In the ones that were thinned prior to prescribed fire, we had 90% mortality. In those plots, 40% of the whitebark pine died from fire. So fire was the primary cause of death in our burn plots. So we can kind of say from this that fire is a major risk to mature whitebark pine. We know that they are very susceptible to it. Even moderate severity prescribed fire can cause high mortality. And thinning before burning may have slightly reduced mortality, but not enough to really make a difference. Oh, also, interestingly, mountain pine beetle was highest in our burn plots, which kind of makes sense since we know that mountain pine beetle kind of preferentially selects injured trees or stressed trees. So the implications of these results is that we should carefully consider the pros and cons of prescribed fire if we're using it for whitebark pine restorations, especially in areas where we have our high-value trees. We should modify our ignition strategies if we're going to use it to lower our fire severity. This includes using backing fires, using ground ignitions. This prescribed fire was done via heli torch, and we found that it's harder to direct the fire with the heli torch. And we should continue to thin around high-value trees to reduce wildfire risk, even though it wasn't super effective in this. There's probably ways we could do it better, which I'll discuss more later. Our second goal was to alleviate competition for mature whitebark pine by reducing the density of competing trees and understory vegetation. And to assess this, we looked at tree growth response. Um, so we collected increment cores from 18 trees, 10 in the thinning treatment, 3 in the wildfire treatment, and 5 in the control treatment, and basically looked at the tree ring width from 4 years pre-treatment and 4 years post-treatment to see if there's any measurable form of release. So what we'd expect to see is that the tree rings were close together prior to the treatment, and then after the treatment they get bigger because the tree is not being or not under as much competition and is able to grow more. Um, to assess this, we did 2 analyses. The first was paired t-tests to see whether there's any release in individual trees. Then we also used a linear model to see if there's any kind of differences between treatments. And what we found was that there's no significant growth response in any sample or between any of the treatments, which is pretty surprising. We know from a study from Bob Team in 2007 that there is like mature trees do display release after treatment. So why aren't we seeing it here? Well, one of the reasons is that our forests were already quite open, so it could just be limited inter-tree competition. In our study site, when compared to that one by Bob, almost, or our basal area of our forest were almost 50% less. We also had a low sample size and did not sample our plus trees, so those high value trees that were the focus of the treatment because we didn't want to risk injuring them, which could have had an effect. There's also may have been some climatic variation that's confounding our results. And lastly, there could be a lag tree response to treatment. So the trees just take a while and we haven't seen those results in our tree rings yet. The implications of this are if we're thinning for the purpose of releasing mature trees from competition, thinning should target denser stands where the competition limits growth, or specific trees that are being directly outcompeted. Our third goal was to reduce the severity of future fires by lowering fuel loads and mitigating wildfire risk. And to assess this, we looked at fire severity. And fire severity is the magnitude of fire effects on vegetation and soil. So this graph takes a little bit of explaining, but this is our results. On the x-axis again, we have our treatment, obviously only the burned ones because we're interested in fire severity. And on the y-axis, we have composite burn index score, which is kind of a metric of 1 to 3 that you gather for each of the forest strata and then combine to get a total score, which is displayed here. Maybe more interestingly for you, though, we can classify these as different fire severities. So red, we have high severity fire. Orange, we have moderate severity fire. And yellow, we have low severity fire. And these are classes that were created specifically for Glacier National Park by Kira McCauley. Thanks, Kira, for that. The points here are our data points, and these are box plots where the line represents the median value and the boxes are the upper and lower quartiles. We also compared the wildfire and prescribed fire treatments using a Mann-Whitney U-test to see if there's a statistical difference between them. We weren't able to do any statistical analyses for the thinning and prescribed fire treatment because there's only 2 plots in that treatment and you can't do much with that statistically. So what we found is that there's a marginally significant difference between the wildfire and prescribed fire. However, as we saw from that previous section, it was kind of insufficient to protect our mature trees. There is a trend of decreasing fire severities with treatment. So wildfire has the highest fire severity, prescribed fire middling, and thinning and prescribed fire has the lowest, which is kind of what we'd expect. There's a high variability in fire severity for our prescribed fire, and this mostly had to do with how the fire was conducted. It was kind of initiated in hot, dry conditions, so we saw higher severity, but later on experienced cooling temperatures and precipitation, and so we ended up with that low severity fire. It's worth noting that the prescribed fire in general was actually quite low severity. It's just our plot happened to fall within higher severity areas. The implications of this are quite similar to our first question. We should modify our ignition strategies to lower fire severity and continue to thin around valuable trees, including surface fuels. So we know that whitebark pine are affected even if just a little bit of the bole is scorched. So by going in and removing the litter and dust layers around the tree, we can protect them from even that little bit of scorching from low severity fire. We should also be considering alternative restoration strategies to fire. For example, thinning followed by planting, where we're worried about injuring our mature trees and seedlings. So our last goal was to enhance whitebark pine regeneration by creating suitable caching areas for Clark's nutcracker and reducing competition from overstory and understory vegetation. And to assess this, I did two analyses. The first was comparing regeneration densities between the treatments. So I looked at seedlings in two size classes. The first was small seedlings, so anything that was less than 30 centimeters in height. The second was all seedlings, which was anything with a diameter of base height of less than 5 centimeters. And with the assumption that seedlings with a height of less than 30 centimeters are more likely to have established post-treatment. The reason for this is we want to know the effects of treatments on new regeneration that came up after the treatment and of all our regeneration. This is just a really quick analysis I did to see whether that assumption of 5-year-old seedlings being 30 centimeters tall was at least within the realm of reality. And it's the age of some seedlings that I just directly sampled based on tree rings versus their height. And what you can see here is that a 5-year-old seedling is estimated to be around 7 centimeters tall with 95% confidence intervals from 0 to around 45 centimeters tall. So this is not really a scientific analysis, but it tells us that our assumption is at least reasonable. So here are some results. This is another box plot. On our y-axis, we have the density of small regeneration in stems per hectare. And on our y-axis, we have our treatment type. And there's a few things I want you to take away from this. Oh, whoops. Sorry. Generally, regeneration densities were lower in our burn plots. So the median regeneration density in our wildfire was 12.5 stems per hectare. In our prescribed fire, it was 0 stems per hectare. And in our control plot, it was up all the way up at 75 stems per hectare. Thinning in prescribed fire had the highest regeneration density, but that's mostly due to this one plot where we found the highest regeneration of any plot in our study. It's a super interesting result. One data point can't really tell us much though. But for future study, for all regeneration, that's small seedlings and large seedlings. Oh, and I'm getting a notification that my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if you lose me.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Jeremy. It's just you like cut out like a little bit, but I think it's manageable, at least on my end. So
Okay, yeah. The internet at my work is usually okay, but not always. So yeah, let me know if you miss anything. I can go back. So with the seedling density, we kind of expected our results to be that we should be seeing lots of new regeneration in our burned and thinned areas because we're creating openings for Clark's nutcracker to catch seeds, and we are releasing our seedlings from competition, but that was not the case. So there's a few possible explanations that we came up with. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, our site is already quite open. In our control plot, the canopy cover was only around 27%. So it could be these trees just aren't being outcompeted, and there's plenty of catching areas for Clark's nutcracker. Secondly, could be the time scale. After all, I did this or collected this data in 2023. That's only 5 years after our thinning and wildfire treatment, and 3 years after our prescribed fire. Whitebark pine is a masting species, and so we may not have captured these masting events, although there were mast years in 2018, 2021, and 2022. So we did have good seed crops those years. And lastly, there could just be limited seed source. In the Bald Hills, there is very high blister rust infection rates. It could just be that the whitebark pine seed source is already so compromised that we just aren't seeing the regeneration we need to show up in these plots. So the implications of this is that fire will not really reliably increase whitebark pine establishment, at least in the short term, and kills existing seedlings and saplings. The other analysis I did for whitebark pine regeneration was to assess the biophysical factors that influence whitebark pine, whitebark pine establishment. So what I did is created generalized linear models to assess the biophysical factors influencing whitebark pine regeneration, including kind of these which whitebark pine establishment and growth. I created single variable and multivariate models. So our key findings for small whitebark pine regeneration, so that's again whitebark pine that were less than 30 centimeters in height. The best model was one that just included the cover of herbs and ferns. This plot here is our model. On the y-axis, we have our seedling density of small regeneration. On the y-axis, we have percent cover of herbs and ferns. The line here is the regression line, so the model output, and the shaded area is our 95% confidence intervals. And black dots are the actual data. Yeah, there's basically a decreasing trend. Once we hit around 10% cover of herbs and ferns, we had almost no whitebark pine seedlings. For all regeneration, the best model included, or was one that included both cover of shrubs in regeneration and cover of herbs and ferns. So whitebark pine regeneration increases with shrub and regeneration cover. When you hold all the other variables constant at their mean values, an increase in the percent cover of shrubs and regeneration from 2% to 85%, which was the observed range in our study plots, was associated with a predicted increase in whitebark pine regeneration density from 122 to almost 2,000 stems per hectare. Whereas with herbs and ferns, we saw basically the exact same trend as we saw with the small regeneration. Once we hit around 10%, we're not seeing any whitebark, at least any whitebark pine seedlings. So there's a few possible explanations for this. While whitebark pine is shade intolerant, there has been studies that show that moderate levels of understory shading actually benefit whitebark pine by reducing mortality from excessive heat during the summer. And shrub cover can also enhance soil moisture levels in the spring and early summer by improving snow retention. Furthermore, there's a possible facultative mycorrhizal relationship between vaccinium species and whitebark pine, and vaccinium was a dominant cover species in pretty much all of our plots. For herbs and ferns, there have been other studies, specifically one by Perkins in 2015, that found that high cover of herbs and ferns and other vegetation can hinder whitebark pine regeneration. In particular, they found that carrot species, so sedges, were linked somehow with whitebark pine decrease. In pretty much all of our plots where we found no whitebark pine seedlings, Carrot rossii, which is Ross's sedge, was found to be a dominant cover species. This might not have anything to do with sedges in particular. It could just be kind of an indication of moisture sites, for example. So bears further study. So the implications of this is that our restoration efforts should prioritize areas with moderate cover of shrubs and regeneration, and particularly we should prioritize areas with vaccinium. We should also avoid areas with high levels of herb and fern cover. So that's mostly for, but also if we want to restore whitebark pine habitat in a way that we want to create areas for seedling establishment, we should keep this in mind. Okay, we're almost there. I just wanted to end up with a few recommendations from this research. And I will say that this research is very place-based, based in Glacier National Park. If like these recommendations are for Glacier National Park, you might be able to take them and use them. I hope you can, but you should definitely think about your context before using them. So for fire, prescribed fire should be focused to areas of potential whitebark pine habitat that currently lack significant populations of whitebark pine, but exhibit dense overstory cover, or to areas with a high white pine blister rust disease load. So basically, we want to focus our prescribed fire efforts to either areas where whitebark pine have been excluded, either maybe they've been outcompeted, but it is potential habitat, or to areas that have such high white pine blister rust disease load that we want to burn them to reset succession. This approach will reduce the risk of compromising existing healthy seed-bearing trees while creating suitable conditions for seed catching by Clark's nutcracker or for planting as part of restoration efforts. In areas with low seed source availability, prescribed fire treatments should and indeed must be paired with the planting of putatively resistant whitebark pine seedlings. Secondly, we should collect scion from high-value whitebark pine trees before fire events to ensure valuable genetics are not lost. Since we don't know when fires are going to happen, we should do that as soon as possible. Oh, sorry, I had one more note here. Surviving whitebark pine trees, high-value ones, should be treated with anti-pine beetle pheromones. It's worth noting that in these plots, any of our plus trees that we protected around that were affected by our prescribed fire, even if they didn't die in the fire, have since died or are on their way to dying from mountain pine beetle. So, they may survive that initial fire injury, but they may not survive mountain pine beetle attack after that. For thinning, given the high mortality rates of whitebark pine from fire, thinning treatments should continue around whitebark pine trees with the goal of fire protection. Special attention should be given to removing all surface fuels in proximity to these trees, as even low levels of scorch can kill trees directly, or as I said, by increasing their susceptibility to mountain pine beetle. Thinning operations for the purpose of releasing mature trees from competition, if they continue, should only be implemented around specific trees that are directly suppressed by competing species. Well-prescribed fire is generally unsuitable for this purpose due to the risk of mature tree mortality. We might be able to use targeted field reduction treatments, we might be able to use fire if we have targeted field reduction treatments and kind of use this really low severity hand ignition under the right moisture situations. So I don't want to say don't use fire for this. It's just do it very carefully if you can use it. Lastly, we should resurvey the plots that I established every 5 years to determine the mid to longer term effects of these treatments on whitebark pine survival, release, and establishment. Again, this is a pretty short-scale or short-term study on a tree that regularly lives up to 1,000 years. So the longer-term effects are really important. Additionally, restoration strategies should be continually refined based on monitoring results and emerging scientific research. An adaptive management approach is essential for improving restoration success in the face of changing ecological and climatic conditions. Just wanted to end off by just acknowledging a few people who helped out with this. This includes my committee, My supervisor was Dr. Laurie Daniels at UBC, and my boss, Natalie Stoppel, helped out a ton with this project as well. My funders include the Tree Ring Lab at UBC, Parks Canada, and the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. I got one of your student research grants that Bob was talking about at the start. Thank you so much. That went straight into increment corridors. And then just a huge shout out to the field crew that helped me out with this work. We experienced pretty much every sort of weather condition possible, camping out in the backcountry for weeks at a time, from thunderstorms, hail, to driving winds, and our cook shelter almost um, blew away. And we also had the large high severity fire that started just a few kilometers from our study site, which definitely was exciting. um, I haven't had the chance to publish this in any journals yet. I'm working on it very slowly. But if you're interested in learning more, here's a QR code that leads you to my thesis, which is free to download. And yeah, that's all I have for you for today.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was great. We do
No
have a
worries. I'll
couple.
leave this up for a second just in case anybody wants to scan it. But yeah.
All right. So I will leave a little bit of time for people to put more questions in the chat. Looks like we've got a few minutes left. Yeah, so thanks again. And I'll go ahead and start with this first one here. So John Burley says, great presentation and work, Jeremy. How many years after prescribed burn would you recommend supplemental or restoration planting? How many years after thinning? And what thoughts do you have on planting competition in these types of treatments? I think you talked some about this. And so like it is, as an example, competition versus nurse plants and microsite conditions. So I think yeah, like I said, I think you did talk about some of this.
Yeah,
But
I
I
have a.
guess,
Oh, sorry. Go
oh
for
no,
it.
go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I can tell you that in the national parks here, we plant we look at planting anything that has burned in the last 40 years, but really prioritize areas that have burned in the last 10 years. You don't really want to go like right after the fire happens. You kind of want to wait 3 years. Um, and yeah, no more than 40, but kind of within that 3 to 10 years range seems to be ideal. I mean, it needs a lot more research, but that's what we've been doing. Um, and then as for planting whitebark pine, um, could you just repeat that part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, totally. I guess like when would you recommend restoration planting, like after thinning specifically? Um,
Oh, yeah. If you're thinning a plot and you want to, or a site and you want to plant, you can plant right away. I don't think there's any time frame. There's kind of to speak to that a little bit, not as much with, we haven't done any planting in thinned areas, but I think it's definitely an option in the future. But um, we are finding that like we need to be really careful about where we choose to plant whitebark pine seedlings because there's been some areas that are too productive of sites, and then we end up seeing that everything grows so much faster than whitebark pine that it just gets outcompeted right away and it isn't able to establish. So yeah, just kind of putting some thought into where you're going to do those planting. And then yeah, definitely as you're talking about microsites and stuff, definitely plant in those microsites. And oh, something I didn't mention in the um, that kind of Parks Canada section of the talk is we also have a contract out right now to analyze all our seedling data from the field trials. And so hopefully we'll have some data to actually show what microsites work best. We've also been kind of trying to plant single seedlings versus clumps, because the collection tracker plants treated clumps. And so we'll have some data on like what actually is working for planting, which is really exciting.
Nice. That is exciting. I think we're kind of working on something a little bit similar.
Oh, I can't
We're
wait.
exceeding. Yeah, so there'll be lots of information. Yeah, that's great. Karen Nelson, I think we have time for this one. Karen Nelson says, great study, Jeremy. For your regeneration by treatment analysis, to what extent do you think baseline site-to-site differences in regeneration rates may have like swamped to some degree your treatment results? She just mentioned that she noticed there was a lot of variation in the control sites, and Enzo kind of had a question about that too.
Yeah, great question. So ideally, we would have done the study over like a lot more plots. Um,
Always, yeah.
always. I think what we're finding is just like, especially here in Glacier, none of our alpine areas or whitebark pine habitat is accessible by anything but helicopter, like a 2-day walk. So yeah, I think there's definitely we're always seeing variation in the ecological data. Basically, what I was able to come up with here is trends. And um, yeah, I think that we have valuable data. I think if we collect several kind of concurrent years of data, like if we do this study again in 2027, and then after that, we'll be able to kind of see more of what's happening. But I think this is a really good start and
Yeah,
place to go for future research.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in like a perfect world, if you could go back to all your sites again in like, you know, 20 years, 50 years, like when would you
Yeah.
go back and what would you want to collect data on? What are you curious about?
Oh,
Long-
yeah. So I think definitely like seedling densities, super interesting question. I think that like it needs to be studied more, especially here about how seedlings establish post disturbance for whitebark pine. And then also I think that tree release question is interesting. So collecting more increment cores and seeing if we can actually see any release over a longer time scale. Um, yeah, and then also I'd want to collect data on um, other species establishing. There's some very interesting stuff happening with climate change right now and kind of subalpine encroachment by other species in Glacier National Park. So I think that we might see kind of different stuff in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. A lot of work to be done. Well, we got
Oh
a
yeah.
couple things here in the chat still, but I think we're going to leave it at that. There's always, we can send you some of these more specific questions and comments
Yeah, I was wondering,
webinar.
should I share my email in the chat if people have any questions? I'm
We
happy to
have it. So
answer.
if you're okay with
Okay,
us
perfect.
sharing it, I think what we'll do is we'll probably just like relay these things to you and then you can answer them and we'll do some of the like legwork and
Perfect.
getting
That sounds great.
people. Yeah. I
Okay, well, thanks
have a
for
question
listening,
too, I
everybody.
might ask also. Uh, all right. Well, that is awesome. So on behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, I want to thank Jeremy Greenberg again for your participation in our series. It really means a lot to us. And our next webinar will be on April 21st, featuring Jennifer Heaton, a current master's student from Cal Poly Humboldt, and research ecologist Michael Kaufman, who is also a former WPEF board member. And they will be tag teaming a talk on the health of foxtail and whitebark pine in the Klamath Mountains. So mark your calendars, and thanks again, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for our upcoming installments. Thanks again, Jeremy. Have a great day.